you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's always a privilege to be able to talk about nonviolence and what it means to me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the personal and the systemic are interlinked, and how if we have that understanding, we can find openings to obstacles in conflicts and in the current moment. I work with communication in conflict situations, so as part of my work I'm inputting listening skills to increase people's capacity to connect to the vulnerable human reality which is underneath possibly harsh and violent positions. I also work with grief as well, because when needs are really not being met, then we need to have a space to process grief, to connect to grief. It's something that we need a lot of at the moment. Grief is just as much part of life as love, so I really think it's an important thing to do, to be holding space for grief. A little bit about my process and how I got to be where I am now. In the early 90s, I went to Belfast as part of the Women in Ireland delegation to try and understand what was happening in the Troubles there. And since then, I've been really interested in peace processes and how they work. I've learnt a lot from someone called Claire McCartney, who was a social worker at the time, who tuned into the peace process and worked kind of behind the scenes. And one of the things that he says that he could see this happening in the difficulties in the Troubles, that people started to work with mediation. Not mediation around the conflict, but mediation, family mediation, and neighbourhood mediation. And at first he thought this was a cop-out. He thought, why are we doing that when we could be, why are we looking at the interpersonal when this big systemic thing is happening? And then he realised what was happening is that we were preparing people for peace and dialogue and negotiation. He kind of realised that that takes time for people to actually have an embodied experience that dialogue works. And this links in with a very similar conclusion that a young Israeli activist called Gali has also made. She was part of an initiative called the Phoenix Plan, which brought together young Israeli and Palestinian activists to create a kind of a plan for peace in Israel-Palestine. And she said that, you can't even use the word peace there. Peace is associated with a sellout, with lack of integrity, with lack of justice. You can't use the word. So much so that preparing the public for peace is one of the 5 points, one of the opportunities that they've discovered, outlined in their plan. So that's a really good thing to check out, the Phoenix Plan. So if we think that preparing the public for peace is a really helpful thing to do, it's because it's a way of linking the personal and the systemic. That needs to happen on multiple levels and in multiple arenas. And there is a lot of obstacles to that. Obstacles such as advocating for dialogue is sometimes ridiculed when the gap between where we're at now and having dialogue and negotiations is too much. So that's why people think we can't dialogue with these people. Often in conflict, people will say, whether that's interpersonal conflict or work conflict or systemic conflict, people will say, we cannot dialogue with these people. Both sides say that. So that's one thing that gets in the way. And another thing that gets in the way of dialogue is the perceived moralism of the peace movement as well. That the peace movements aren't meeting people where they're at, aren't really understanding the fact that someone is willing to pick up guns and to defend themselves or their communities. So to really understand that reality. And of course there's this dominant understanding that the way to get your point across is through threat or force or coercion. And we're all socialised with that. The way to make your point is to shout louder. This gets in the way, and of course what underpins that is the whole military-industrial complex, that war is the only way to create change, that the idea that war is the only way forward. I don't know if any of you have seen Max Porter's speech or poem called Wild West. It's a really visceral and rousing, he draws attention to the way systems of power and privilege in the UK are enabling war in Gaza. It's a really fantastic sort of 10 minutes drawing attention to the hypocrisy of doing things to Gaza that we wouldn't do here, and because there's a market for it. And the utter disconnection, he draws attention to that utter disconnection. And of course, when people have resources and power and privilege, they forget they are part of human suffering. That again is the disconnection. So these are all the obstacles, or some of the obstacles, to mobilising for peace. This is where we are right now. And I'll just pause there with, there's quite an immense amount of obstacles that we are facing. And there's a poem by a Brazilian poet called Paulo Leminski, which I always love because it really supports my work, which is, it's 4 lines. This willingness to be exactly who we are is what will take us beyond. This willingness to be exactly who and what we are is what will take us beyond. And in conflict and in mediation, that's exactly where we need to start. We are in conflict. This is where we are. We need to really deeply accept that and face that in order to move beyond. I've just been in southern Spain, a gathering of activists and individuals from across Europe and the Middle East, and we were fortunate to have around 10 Israelis or Israeli diaspora, and about 8, which is amazing, Palestinians or Palestinian diaspora. And at certain points the gap felt too huge, and we needed to understand that this is where we are, too huge to dialogue. For example, on the first afternoon, all members of a particular group were absent. What was happening wasn't quite landing for them, so they took themselves off and did something else. Of course, that's where they were. That makes total sense, that they were taking care of themselves and actually bonding as a group to then come back, and we had a fantastic week. But we didn't panic the fact that some people had kind of absented themselves from the process and the time. People need to understand that people need to trust that they are able to say what they want to say in the way that they want to say it. And they don't have to renounce anything or denounce anything to have a seat at the table. And we really need to increase people's capacity to hear the needs underneath what is being shared. So that's where communication comes in. We need to change the way we listen. And as well as enabling all voices to have a space, we really need to be aware of power asymmetry. So it might mean that we have different formats for listening and speaking. So for example, in the gathering that we had, there was a fishbowl of Palestinian voices, witnessed by the whole gathering, while Israelis did need to have an intra-group discussion of their own to each other, but that didn't need to be witnessed by everyone, and certainly not by Palestinian people, unless they specifically wanted to. So all of these dynamics are really important, and coming back to what Clem was saying, he starts off, we need to make contact with people in order to have dialogue across different positions. We need to kind of create mutual understanding. In Spain, that was where we started. And then we can move on to joint analysis and problem solving together to make agreements together. But we were very much at that first stage. There's a lot more, but maybe I'll sort of move to wrapping up now. To a few things that we can be doing as individuals to support where we are in this current moment. I think one of the things that is really helpful is to make it okay for people to change their minds. When I say this, I mean on a kind of interpersonal level and broader in work context and systemically as well. For people to say, I used to think this, I was wrong, now I think this. We actually really need to celebrate that and not kind of lambast them as weak for changing their minds. So that's one thing. We also need to offer a dispassionate place for people to think through their political situations. And Clem McCartney talks about this, how he would be a listening ear for people on both sides. Because when you are in conflict, you have to talk within a very limited discourse. You can only be on message. You can only talk about your message. You can't show any uncertainty because your followers will feel betrayed and your opponents will think you're being weak and capitalise on your uncertainty. So if we can be a space for people to share their uncertainty, I want to change my mind but I'm too scared to do it, this act of listening is something that we can all do in our circles. And to keep validating, this is where we are without judgment, so people can name obstacles and be truthful about where we're at. Because everyone has a piece of the solution, and all of our stories are necessary to move us forward. And just the last final thing is that it's very difficult to sustain the gaze at the moment, to keep our focus on all the conflicts that are happening, the utter violence, the horror. So we do need grief work to come together to express our despair and grief, to allow ourselves to feel pain while being accompanied by each other. It's very resourcing if we can do that. And because we have learned from trauma-informed somatics that we do embody our cultures and our social conditioning, even if we don't agree with it. So we need to come back to our bodies, our breath. We really need to ground and notice our emotional states, so we can notice what's the fear in our hearts, the grief in my belly, to notice these. And this awareness of this is where I am in my body, that is what's going to take us beyond as well. So, thank you for listening.